All right. Good afternoon and welcome to our Wednesday Bible study time. Glad for all those who are able to be present here today and for those who are joining in through YouTube today or will tune in at some point in the remainder of the week. For any who are tuning in by YouTube, and if you haven't seen the email that we sent out or haven't heard about some of the news of things going on, we want to remind you of two things and invite you to be a part of them this coming Sunday. Of course, we're in the season of Advent. Every Sunday in Advent, you can see the beauty of the sanctuary already around you. The worship in Advent is a very rich season, and we encourage you to come and be a part of that worship each and every Sunday. This Sunday after the Sunday afternoon at 4:30, we are having our Christmas meal and also our children's Christmas play. The play starts officially at 4:30. We would encourage you to come at 4:15-ish to find a seat and get settled before the play starts. Our children have been working hard on it. They're going to be downstairs doing the play downstairs in the fellowship hall. So once you come and get situated, then you will be situated for the play and for the meal. And once the play is over, then we'll engage in the meal together. The Christmas meal is a wonderful meal, delicious meal. It's always a good time of fellowship, and so we would encourage you to come and be a part of that this Sunday at 4:30. If you could, or if you're planning to come, please let us know in the church office so that we can let them know as they prepare food for that on Sunday afternoon. So again, that's at 4:30 on Sunday afternoon. Children's play first, followed by the Christmas meal. And then the next Sunday, the 12th, during the worship service, our choir will be leading worship through the presentation of a musical, a seasonal musical, of course, one that focuses on the good news of Jesus Christ, his birth, and his coming into the world for our salvation. The choir's been working hard on that, and we encourage you to come and be a part of that service, a special one of our services in this season. So just a couple of items to pass along to you for any who may not have heard or have not paid attention to some of those things in the notes that have come your way. We are today going to finish up in chapter 2. I know we've been doing this for 2 weeks, 2 times now, but that's okay. We don't have to hurry through our Bible study. We can take our time going through the lesson, and there's a couple things here that I want to come back and touch base with. And I'd really like those who are here today to have your comments made as we're going to be talking about some things that can raise some issues for churches and their conversations together. I'd certainly like for you all to please help me talk through this with you today. So we're looking at that last part of chapter 2. We hope we may get started in chapter 3. We may not. We'll come back to it next week. Either way, we'll be working through chapter 3 next week. But the last couple of verses in the last portion of chapter 2 have some issues that are raised there that can be somewhat controversial, or at least engage in some conversation. And I think there's some very fruitful conversation that because we don't want to get into all the controversy, have avoided for far too long. We'll just kind of read that whole of the section there, beginning with verse 8 in chapter 2 of 1 Timothy, the last verses of that chapter, and then we'll come back and talk about the latter verses of that chapter. Beginning with verse 8 of chapter 2 in 1 Timothy. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Also that the women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. We've talked about most of that to this point, and we talked the last time we were gathered together specifically about the teaching to let women learn in silence with full submission. And we talked the last time about how in the Jewish tradition, women were not taught the Torah. They were not allowed to be taught the Torah. And we segued from that into the observation that in the church, women were taking on new roles in the life of the community of God than they had had in the Jewish world. Now, the Gentile women coming in, it was still a patriarchal society, but they would not have had perhaps that much strictness as was in the Jewish tradition. We also need to keep in mind that Paul is dealing with his Jewish tradition. He's dealing with the Judaizers in the church who are arguing that the Gentiles need to be made fully Jewish in order to become Christian. And again, any kind of trouble that they have in the church, the Judaizers are saying, see, that's because you let them get away with not keeping the law. You need to make them observe the law of Moses when they come into the church to be Christians. So Paul had that dynamic going on. He also had persecution from outside the church, the Jewish authorities, who did not believe Jesus to be the Messiah and, believed that they were worshiping Jesus as a human being. And so they were, as Paul had once been, they were, critics of the church and trying to oppress the church in every way. Paul, as a persecutor of the church, would have been especially attuned to all those debates that were going on and all those points that they were trying to make against the church to dissuade Jewish people from becoming Christians. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and Paul is trying to sort through all that. You've got this the church that is opening doors for women in ways that hadn't been opened before, and yet the Jewish tradition with all its strictures about male and female. And so this first teaching about the women remaining silent in the church in full submission really kind of echoes what he had grown up with. Oh, also, we need to keep in mind the context of the church in Ephesus at this time. And we see some allusions to some trouble with some of the women in the church, some of the younger women in the church. Let me invite you to turn to chapter 5. This is a chapter where Paul is dealing primarily with the issue of widows in the church. And we'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks. It seems not just that the church was taking care of the widows, providing for their material needs, but that the widows also functioned in some sort of a ministerial fashion. They had some sort, they evidently took a vow as widows, and they were made useful in the church in some way. What we see in other places, part of their ministry was to minister to the younger women and to help them know how to be good Christian women. But in Ephesus, there was some unruliness going on among some of the younger widows. So if you look in chapter 5, beginning in verse 9, you hear Paul saying, don't put anybody on the roll. That's really good Baptist stuff, isn't it? Don't put anybody on the roll as a widow who is not, who is younger than 60. And that's what he says here, the first verse, 9. Let a widow be put on the list if she is not less than 60 years old and has been married only once. She must be well attested for her good works as one who has brought up children, shown hospitality, washed the saints' feet, helped the afflicted, and devoted herself to doing good in every way. You see by that designation that they had some ministerial function in the life of the church. Verse 11, but refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when their sensual desires alienate them from Christ, they want to marry. In other words, they've made a vow not to marry, but because they're younger and, they may want to marry, and then they're going to have to break that vow. And so they incur condemnation for having violated their first pledge. Besides that, they learn to be idle, gadding about from house to house. And they are not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not say. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and manage their households so as to give the adversary no occasion to revile us. Immediately think of those last words in chapter 2 about how women will be saved through childbearing. And you can see there may be what Paul is saying there is if these younger widows will, get married and have children and tend to their households like they're supposed to, they won't be going from house to house and getting in all sorts of trouble and stirring up stuff in the church. So again, you see that that's in the background of this as well when we read through this passage. So verse 12, I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So that's what I want us to think about first. And what Paul is saying, there are two things I think that Paul is saying here. Number one of the teachings that he teaches in various of the letters is that men are the head of women. Christ is the head of men, and men are the head of women, and parents are the head of children, and masters are the head of the slave. And so that's part of Paul's teaching. You find it explicated most intensely in chapter 5 of Ephesians. But there's that theology that is there, and that theology derives from a theological perspective on the Adam and Eve story in Genesis. Adam was born first, right? Or Adam is made first, and Eve comes second. The Genesis story tells us that Eve is taken from Adam and is created. And so in the Jewish mindset, that's where this thinking about the husband being head of the wife really derives from. Adam was created first, and then Eve was created. And so for the woman to take authority over the man was for her to subvert the order of creation. So whether you want to agree with that or not, you at least need to understand where it's coming from. And that's Paul's take on that teaching in Genesis. The other thing is, Eve in the story, Eve is the one who transgresses first and leads Adam into transgression. And so that's what Paul is saying here. He's making, basically his argument is here, for women to be teaching in the church in general, is for them to be breaking that pattern of the man being the head of the husband being the head of the wife. And it's also suspect because Eve, was the one who sinned first. And he's implying that, women are susceptible to sin in a way that Adam wasn't. So I'm just laying it all on the table for you. It's right there. And I'm inviting your conversation. And I just want you to understand what all is here. And it's on the table. And again, remember all the things that are going on. We don't know if some of these widows were involved in teaching in the church. We don't know if some of the teachers in the church were women who were encouraging these widows in this direction. There is a teaching we're going to see in the beginning of chapter 4 where some of the false teachers were teaching that you shouldn't get married. And they were teaching kind of an ascetical sort of life. And so we don't know all the underpinnings of all this. But Paul uses these arguments to say that the women shouldn't be teaching over men. Now, saying all that, remember what is going on in the church. Women are prophets. A prophet is somebody whom God inspires to speak a word to the people. And so prophecy, a man could be a prophet, a woman could be a prophet. Women were praying in the church. We know this in 1 Corinthians 11. Women were hosting the church in their homes. Lydia had the church in her home. So this is not a blanket condemnation of women leading in the church. This is about teaching in the church, and this is a situation where there has been errant teaching in the church. So that's what Paul is saying here. That's how Paul is arguing here. That's why he is making the case he's making. And again, we, as Baptists, we weigh things out and we make interpretations accordingly. And so, however you want to come to terms with that, you can come to terms with that as you feel led. Let me just say, what are your thoughts, first of all? Because I've got one thing I want to bring up from that in just a second. But how do y'all hear Paul here? What do you think? How do you hear these verses, and how do you make sense of them? Nobody wants to venture forth. Okay. Right. And I don't think Paul would say, men are better than women, and he would have never sinned if it hadn't been for her. I don't think Paul is saying that. But yeah, I mean, he is making the case that Eve was first in sin, and therefore, as a teacher in the church, that gives him pause. Well, it means he can't allow it. That's what he's saying here. A lot of people interpret exactly as you are, that this reflects the patriarchal norms of the society of that day, and that Paul is simply a man of his time. Now, to play the devil's advocate, where do you draw the line with that? Because there are other things that Paul talks about, and that's always the issue, that we deal with. Slavery is one of those issues. And most of us say, Paul's lack of condemnation of slavery comes from the fact that slavery was accepted in that time. And of course, the slavery of that day and the slavery that we associate with, which is Civil War days or the pre-Civil War days, not necessarily the same thing. Many differences, actually. And so it's a much more complicated case. But in terms of dealing with slavery, many Christians have argued in the same way as we think and talk about issues of male-female relationships and participation in the life of the church. Anybody else have things you want to share? Well, where I want to go with this is I want you to consider the possibility of hearing Paul here, of saying, and hearing in this particular way, is there something in the female nature that made Eve susceptible to sin in that particular moment? At the same time, are there things in the male nature that make them susceptible to other types of sin? What I'm getting at is what I referenced the other day when we met. Where are the men in the church? Why aren't men in the church? A lot of people have talked about this and have wondered about this, and they have talked along these lines, though not necessarily on this passage. One of the arguments is that the church has been feminized over the course of history. It's been made to be less manly in certain ways. And, we have in our generation, in our culture, we have gone through a feminization of culture. And I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just saying that has taken place. When I was a teenager in the 70s, ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, was all abuzz. Who was it? The tennis players, Bobby Riggs and what was her name? Can't think of. Remember they played that famous match on TV. I think Howard Cosell, Billie Jean King. Thank you. That was the big rage in those days, and so we had those issues stirring up, and in our neck of the Baptist woods, we are moderate Baptists. However you want to understand moderate, but we are moderate Baptists. Which I interpret as, we avoid the extremes, we stay the middle course. And so we've embraced a lot from the culture and tried to let it help influence our understanding of the faith while not embracing everything from the culture. But have we, as moderate Baptists, and this question we ought to ask about this, I think, Did we embrace it too much? Did we not embrace it critically and embrace, allow it to influence in certain ways and not in others? Because the fact of the matter is, we have a problem with men in the church. Now, is it because the church is too feminine? And by feminine, I mean, the characteristics, and we have to stereotype. I'm sorry, we just have to stereotype. There's always truth in stereotypes, even as it doesn't cover everything. But the feminine characteristics of the nurturing, caring, loving, accepting, relational, those types of characteristics, has the church embraced them so much? And do men not come to church because there's too much of that in the church? When I was when I was in seminary, and whenever I'd call home, if my dad ever answered the phone, he'd immediately hand it to my mother. Say, here's your mom. He didn't do any of the lovey-dovey, touchy-feely kind of stuff. I don't remember my dad hugging me. Now, I'm not bruised and, all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that. But, that just wasn't a manly thing to do. And so there's some truth to this. There is some truth to this, that some of the things that are feminine in characteristics, and some of the things that are manly or male characteristics, they bump heads. So I think there's some validity to it. I don't think it explains everything at all. One of the things that I think a male characteristic, the emphasis on logic and rationality and all that kind of stuff. My sons, both of them have grown up, been in Baptist life all their years. And when they were teenagers in our church up in Haymarket, they had a hard time with the teaching. There were women teaching, number one, and most of the lessons were these touchy-feely kind of lessons, which they hated. It's kind of like, you get to a certain point in VBS where all the kids will do the movements and the songs and all that kind of stuff, and then at a certain point, the boys don't want to do that anymore. And so they were at that point as teenagers. And so Carter's favorite teacher along the way, a man named Bill Crisp, a very, kind of reserved, stern kind of guy, very thoughtful man, and very much kind of a lecturer. And he taught the Sunday school for, maybe one quarter or something like that. Carter loved it. That was the best teacher he ever had. Of course, only Carter and somebody else showed up because the girls didn't really like that. But they wanted that intellectual kind of stimulation. They wanted a rational understanding of the faith. So why are men not in the church? I think it can be some of that type of stuff. We are made differently, and has the church embraced too much, or has the church, embraced it so much that we push the male attributes out? The other side of it is, I'm self-contained. I can do it all myself. I don't need any help. We don't ask for help on the road. We don't follow anybody else's instructions. We just want to figure it out ourselves. I think there's a certain amount of that in men generally. We kind of want to be our own saviors. Talk of needing God doesn't hit men well. The talk of submission to God, that doesn't really ring well with men. And so, if we talk about, are there certain things about being female that make women more susceptible to sin? There are certainly things about men that make them more susceptible to other types of sin. You see what I'm saying? I believe in the complementarity of us. We're made for each other. We're made to complete each other. And that's, I think that's very true. But I think some of these things are out there and they need to be talked about. There is no good male spirituality in moderate Baptist life. There isn't. If you want to have somebody tell you what it means to be a man, you've got to go into more fundamentalist kind of circles. they're glad to tell you. And it's, it's some of that stuff that we don't really cotton to. But nobody has done that in moderate Baptist life very well. And right. Right. Once they've been to Paris, they're not going to go back to the farm out in the country. Sure. I agree. But I still want to push the question, is there something here, because we don't have men in the church. We just don't. You're living proof of it right now. And the men that are here are working somewhere, right? Yes. Right. Sure. Right. Exactly. Hmm. Right. I don't. I think it's that it's a complicated thing. There are no easy answers to this, and that's why. And again, I'm not trying to do this, quote unquote, to get men in the church. We need to have a healthy spirituality, and we recognize that men and women are different, and that has an impact in how church life carries out. And so we need to we need to investigate it more. I think what's happened, and you see this. I read one man who was talking about spirituality over the hundreds of years ago, and how some of the spiritual, quote unquote, giants, we call them today, the relationship with Jesus became more of a kind of quasi, not sexual, but it was more of a boyfriend kind of thing. It was more Jesus is my husband, that kind of, and you know where I'm going with that, but it still has that connotation. And this person argued that was horrible for men to hear. I mean, you're not going to relate to Jesus as, and so all this kind of lovey-dovey language about my life's not complete unless Jesus is, makes me whole, and all this kind of stuff is not good male spirituality. And yet it came to dominate in the church, this man argued. And again, we got to be real frank, but if you look at some of the problems that the Catholic Church has, it has to do with, an over-feminization of the clergy. I mean, a lot of the clergy, and that's got to do with a lot of things, but they have a lot of difficulty with homosexuality in the clergy. They just do. And some of these people are very, are mindful of that. And so this isn't about women being better than men or men being better than women. It's about us being complete in the church, and the church, having a more holistic understanding of things. So, my impression of things is that women have taken on more leadership in the church because men have gone off. Why do women become deacons in churches over the past 50 years? It's not because churches made a conscious decision, we need to have women on deacons. It's because men stopped being deacons. Men stopped participating in the life of the church. And who do you go turn to? You turn to the women to fill the holes. That's been my experience of the churches that I've served the past 30 years. The first church I served, Nancy Jones, wonderful, wonderful woman, just like a lot of y'all. Matriarch of the church. I mean, just top notch. She's been a school teacher, one of my favorite people in all the world. And, she, when the men stopped doing things and they started putting her up for a deacon, well, they would go get some Jim Bob who didn't show up to church anytime and vote him in as a deacon rather than her. And she got tired of it, and, after a while wouldn't let her name be put up. And then finally she got onto the deacon board, and so women started being deacons in that church. Didn't set well with a lot of the men, but there were no men left. And that's how that happened there. And so, and again, that goes beyond the issue of, should women be deacons or not be deacons? That's a different conversation. This is about, I think, again, recognizing the need for there to be a healthy male spirituality. We are lacking because we are in this generation, and everything in the culture now is, we're moving away from gender to gender fluidity. So there is no male or female anymore. But it's just kind of this thing. The dam's just burst, and everything's going in that direction. And what we need is healthy male spirituality. I've told y'all before in several settings, but one of my, when I was a little boy, Leona P. Brown, wonderful, wonderful lady. She was my teacher, and for several years along the way. Wonderful teachers all along the way, most of them women. When I got to be a teenager, and I don't know why it was this way, but I had men as teachers. And I had men active with me before that. The first time I ever went fishing was some men in the church who took a bunch of us boys fishing one time. But my Sunday school teacher in my teenage years was a man named Henson McAuliffe, who was a prominent lawyer, the Solicitor General for Atlanta during the years that I was a teenager. And he was my primary male mentor outside my father. And that was significant for me. And again, as I've learned from my son, I listened to both my sons talk at the beach, and they were talking about this issue. They raise it themselves. I don't raise it. But they lament not having those male figures, along the way in their teen years. And I think that's something we need to be thinking about and talking about as the church. We don't need to be afraid. We need to have honest conversations about these things, and we just haven't done it to this point. So, like I said, I've not seen anything in moderate Baptist life that addresses the issue of male spirituality. We just kind of let the boys fend for themselves. And I think that's something that has to be done. So this whole thing starts off with Eve getting Adam in trouble, but you know what? It goes both ways. And I think that's a significant issue for the church to be thinking about. Our being male and female, we're strong in certain ways and we're weak in other ways. And we're given to each other by God to complete each other. And I think that model should be in the church as well. We should have a healthy church that is both male and female. that has, the proper combination of those things. But no, I really, back to what you were saying, Francis, to me, it's not been an aggressiveness. It's been, women have carried the church for years. In times of war, men went to fight. The women, took care of the church. And the women have been the more faithful disciples all along the way than the men have. And so, I'll never bash the women. Most of the women that I've known in church life are strong women, faithful women, wonderful, wonderful Christian people. There are just not as many men who have stepped up in that way as there should be, I think. So anyway, I appreciate you helping me talk it out, and we've got to do something. I'm going to do something in the future to kind of jump off at this point. But again, we're not fighting the 1970s ERA battle all over again. We just need to recognize, I think, the need for there to be a more healthy balance in the church, and it's the men's fault. I'll say it right off the top of the bat. It's the men's fault. I believe it's because of our weakness, our weakness as human beings, as male human beings. I think our being male has deficits to it that we haven't recognized and haven't talked about. Just as, it's the same in both directions. And so we're brought together to complete each other. Oh, anyway, I appreciate you indulging that with me, and hope you won't think ill of me for it. But I really do believe it's something we need to be thinking about and talking about. Well, anyway, I hope those who have been tuning in from YouTube have been able to hear most of this and been able to participate. It will be more straightforward next time we get together. We'll be in chapter 3. We'll be talking about the leadership positions in the church. I sent the notes out again today, so you can read over those notes and be ready to engage in that conversation next week. So thank you all for being a part of this today.